The last words of the pilot of IL-14, tail number 87425, were recorded by the dispatcher of the Yakutsk airfield on November 23, 1965 at 14:37. The voice of Senior Lieutenant of Aviation Kravtsov, calm and professional throughout the flight, suddenly wavered, became uncertain, almost childish. "Control room, I'm Kravtsov. Something's wrong. The forest is below, it's looking at us. I repeat, the forest is looking. It's impossible, but the connection is broken. Forever." The plane disappeared somewhere over the vast Siberian taiga, carrying a cargo known only to a few people in the highest echelons of power. The IL-14's hold contained no ordinary military supplies. It contained containers of uranium-235, components for a new generation of nuclear weapons destined for a secret testing site on Novaya Zemlya. The cargo was worth more than the small republic's entire annual budget, but its true value lay beyond the money. If these components fell into the wrong hands, the balance of the Cold War could be irreversibly altered. So 3 days after the plane disappeared, a special flight left Moscow. It carried 7 people, an elite search and rescue team led by Captain Mikhail Streletsky, a war veteran, a man who could find a needle in a haystack if the interests of the state demanded it. They had a guide with them, an old Evenk named Yurekshin, one of the few who knew this part of the taiga like the back of his hand. The locals called him Forest-eyed for his ability to read the taiga like a book. Streletsky was confident of success. He found downed planes in the swamps of Belarus, pulled saboteurs out of the Karelian forests, tracked down deserters in the Caucasus Mountains. For him, the taiga was just another theater of military operations, where it was necessary to apply logic, experience and endurance. He was wrong. A month later, a man hobbled to the gates of the border post on the Olenyok River. It was Yurekshin, but it was hard to recognize him. When he went into the taiga, his hair was black with gray. Now it was white as snow. His face was drawn, his eyes were dull and looked not at his interlocutor, but through him, somewhere into infinity. He weighed 20 kilograms less and moved like an old man, although he was not even 50. But the strangest thing was his words. Yurekshin, who had spoken little and to the point all his life, now muttered incessantly. He whispered about the forest that sees and remembers everything. About trees that think. About roots that touch souls. He repeated one phrase over and over, in Russian and in his native Evenk: they became trees, became roots, now the taiga sees through their eyes. The border guard officer wrote a short report, the guide returned alone. The group is missing. Mental disorder is suspected. The report was sent up the chain of command and a week later landed on the desk of the Lubyanka, in the office of a man who specialized in cases that had no rational explanation. Lieutenant Colonel Valery Severov stood by the window of his office and looked out at snow-covered Moscow. Snowflakes swirled outside the glass, softly falling onto the sidewalks, but his thoughts were far away, in the remote taiga, where the plane with the cargo capable of changing the course of history had disappeared. In his hands lay a thin folder marked, Top Secret. Inside were several pages of dry facts that formed a picture that made no sense. Severov did not believe in mysticism. In 15 years of work in the organs, he had seen enough to know, behind every mystery there is a person. A saboteur, a traitor, a madman, but always a person. He could explain the disappearance of the plane. A catastrophe, inaccurate coordinates, severe weather. The disappearance of the search party also fit within the framework of logic. An accident, an avalanche, an attack by a bear. But the return of one guide in a state close to madness, with stories about thinking trees, this was already beyond his understanding. He opened the folder again and reread the last page, the psychiatric report on Yurekshin's condition. The doctors wrote about deep post-traumatic syndrome, hallucinations against the background of exhaustion, and delusional ideas of persecution. They recommended long-term treatment in a closed institution. But between the lines, confusion was visible. The doctors did not understand what exactly could have broken the psyche of an experienced taiga guide. Severov closed the folder and made a decision. He would fly to Yakutsk himself. He would find this Yurekshin, interrogate him properly, without doctors or orderlies. And then he would go into the taiga and find what was left of Streletsky's group. And the plane. And the cargo. Because there was no alternative. The order was clear: find the components at any cost. Even if it meant believing in the tales about the forest that sees everything. He didn't know then that this decision would change his life forever. That in a few weeks he would stand in the endless taiga and feel the gaze of thousands of invisible eyes. That he would learn the truth about what happened to Streletsky's group. And understand that some secrets are better left unsolved. The snowflakes outside the window were swirling faster and faster, as if nature itself was trying to warn him of danger. But Severov had already picked up the phone and was dialing the number of the airport duty officer. "Get the plane ready for Yakutsk," he said. "Departure tomorrow at dawn." The receiver rang out with the standard, "Yes, sir." And outside the window the wind howled, as if the taiga itself, thousands of kilometers from Moscow, sensed that a new victim was heading towards it. And it prepared to meet it with its ancient, all-seeing embrace. The northeastern air hub of Yakutsk greeted Lieutenant Colonel Severov with icy fog and the smell of kerosene. The frost of -38 degrees Celsius took away his breath, but Severov hardly noticed the cold. Slightly hunched under his heavy overcoat, he walked along the concrete runway, as if he were not walking along an airfield, but on a chessboard, where he had already been assigned the role of the first victim. Border Troops Major Ivanov was waiting for him at the ramp, a stocky fellow with a weathered face and the look of a man who had seen too much white silence. "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, the Gazik is ready for you. 40 minutes to the hospital, then to the headquarters to register the group." The major extended his hand, his fingers were like stone. Severov merely nodded. As they left the airfield gates, they immediately plunged into the milky smog of the tundra evening. The headlights cut out a narrow corridor of light, and it seemed as if the taiga was already breathing somewhere nearby, hiding behind a wall of chilly air. "How's the conductor?" Severov asked when the Gazik's engine began to hum. "Bad. He hardly sleeps, eats with difficulty. The doctor says he is physically exhausted, but the main thing is that his head is broken." "Are you able to talk?" "He speaks, but only in a whisper and mostly in his own language." The car shook on the frozen tracks, and Severov mentally went over the questions with which he was going to bombard Yurekshin. "What do you mean, the taiga sees? Why are you the only one back? Where are the coordinates of the camp?" He did not believe in mysticism, but he understood the value of time. A week ago the forecast had promised a cyclone, and soon the storm could hide any traces forever. The infirmary was a former Gulag barracks, a long wooden building with steam seeping from the cracks. It smelled of carbolic acid and old larch. Yurekshin was placed in a separate room. A Yakut soldier with a PPSH guarded the door. Severov entered. The guide was lying on a high bunk, covered with a deer skin. His face was sunken, his eyes were half open, but his gaze seemed glassy. On his hand was a thread amulet, an ancient shamanic sign. Erection, Severov began quietly, in Russian. You know who I am. I came to understand what happened. The guide blinked, as if returning from afar. His lips moved. Taiga, barely audible. Taiga Haununun, the taiga is watching. I understand. Taiga. But I need facts. Where is the camp? Where is Captain Streletsky? Erection was silent for a long time, then raised his hand and drew a circle in the air. Kolo. Everything is Kolo. You go, you come back. The forest walks behind your back, and the one who hears is already inside. He began to shake, his pupils dilated. Severov sat closer. Did you see the plane? The conductor nodded. Did it crash? He shook his head. Did it land? He sat down like a wood grouse on the snow. But he wasn't broken. And then, the trees came. They whispered. They looked. Severov shuddered. He wrote down the coordinates that the guide had given out chaotically: 3 days to the west of the Black Lake, the morning sun on the left, 7 hills. I will lead people on your trail, said Severov. Is there a way back? Erection looked into his eyes for a long time. Yes. 1. Silver River. Walk at night, when the moon is out, and think of nothing. Taiga hears thoughts. Whoever is afraid, stays. He tore the amulet off his wrist and handed it to Severov. This is a deer's eye. Look with it, not with your own eyes. The lieutenant colonel thought, superstition? But he took the talisman and hid it in his pocket. The border guard's headquarters were housed in a 2-story pre-war building. In an office that smelled of coal dust, Severov presented the plan for the operation. A group of 6. Me, radio operator Senior Lieutenant Kazantsev, medic Captain Lisina, security, Sergeant Chuv and Private Bayshev. And the guide Yegorov, one of the best hunters in the area. And what, without deer? Major General Chernobrov raised an eyebrow. The guide insists on walking. The animals are nervous and can smell the taiga. The general sighed. Well, desperately. 5 days until the first report. Radio silence to be broken only in urgent cases. Severov nodded. It was exactly 5 days that Erection gave. Any longer and the dreams of other people's eyes would begin, after which people would break. The morning was clear and bitterly cold. On the outskirts of the village, the detachment was lining up to leave. Each had quilted jackets, fur boots, SKS carbines and 30-kilogram backpacks. The radio operator carried a heavy Sever 58 on a separate bracket. The medic Lisina carried 2 bags with medicines and ampoules of morphine. Instead of Erection, the silent taiga dweller Alexei Igorov became the guide, a tall Russian with a frostbitten nose. He listened to the old man's stories and believed every word. Will you take the deer sign? Asked Severov, showing the amulet. Igorov shook his head. The forest will show me its signs. Better watch your thoughts. The column moved toward the edge of the forest, where the snow-covered larches stood like sentries. The wind died down, and in the ensuing silence, each step on the crunchy snow crust seemed like a shot. Having crossed the invisible border, people felt a change. The air became thick, humid, smelling of resin and something sweet, reminiscent of rotten mushrooms. The snow cover absorbed sounds, and the familiar creak of boots disappeared, as if the cedars had drunk all the unnecessary noise from the world. Igorov raised his hand, not a word. The forest is listening. They stopped for a rest after 5 hours. The radio operator checked the compass. The needle was twitching, as if in a spasm. Lieutenant noted that 2 of the fighters had a rapid pulse and irregular breathing. The vodka, saved for prevention, did not warm them. The internal trembling was not due to the cold, but to the feeling that you were being watched, although there were only tree trunks and snow around. Severov took out a map. The pencil with which he had marked the distance he had traveled suddenly cracked in half, as if his hand had squeezed it too tightly. The forest reads thoughts. Flashed an absurd phrase, and the lieutenant colonel cut it off irritably. He did not allow himself superstitions. Dusk fell suddenly, like a curtain. They set up camp in a small clearing, but did not light a fire. Yegorov warned that the light in these places calls to those who have left. At night, Severov was awakened by a whisper. The words were unintelligible, but he clearly heard his name, Valerie, here. He grabbed his pistol and, lifting the flap of the tent, saw the darkness in which the tree trunks supported the starry sky. The whisper was repeated. It seemed to come straight from the bark of the nearest larch. But when Severov stepped closer, the night slammed shut like a door. At dawn, radio operator Kazantsev found himself outside the tent, barefoot, in just a padded jacket. The skin on his feet had turned blue. He stood facing the forest, his lips parted, gasping for air. "What are you doing here?" Severov shook him. "I'm listening, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel." They're speaking, very quietly. The radio operator's eyes twitched, focusing, but then drowned again in a whitish haze. Igorov shook his head. "The forest has begun. 3 more days and we will all become like this." Severov remembered Yurekshin's words about the dreams of other people's eyes, and for the first time felt a subtle but real fear. "Then we'll go faster," he answered harshly, although he understood that it wouldn't be faster in this forest. The taiga itself would determine the pace. The squad moved on, and with each step Severov felt the earth pulsating under his soles, and in the depths of his consciousness a strange thought stirred, persistently repeating, "The forest sees." He took a deep breath of the frosty, resin-scented air and forced himself to move. Somewhere ahead, behind a series of snowy hills, lay a crumpled IL-14, and next to it, a secret cargo worth dying for. But what if the taiga had already seen this cargo and made it a part of itself? Pushing this assumption further, Severov quickened his pace. The treetops creaked overhead, as if whispering, and the shadow grew thicker, like a lid slowly descending on a living coffin, and the detachment went deep into the green darkness, to the very heart of the mystery, the name of which no one dared to pronounce aloud. The second day of the journey turned out to be cursed from the very dawn. Radio operator Kazantsev was unable to warm up properly after the night exodus. His teeth were chattering, despite 2 sweaters and a fur jacket. Medic Lieutenant injected him with camphor, but her gray eyes betrayed alarm. She had seen such symptoms only in people who had experienced clinical death. Severov walked ahead, trying his best to maintain the appearance of control over the situation. But inside him, a bad feeling was building. Yesterday, when they first entered the taiga, the forest seemed simply stern and silent. Today, it seemed to have come alive. The branches that had hung motionless yesterday were now swaying slightly, although there was no wind. The snow underfoot fell unevenly, creating the feeling that the earth was breathing. And most importantly, the sounds. Somewhere at the edge of hearing, a quiet crackling sounded constantly, as if someone invisible was breaking thin twigs in time with their steps. Igorov, the guide, walked in complete silence. His usually calm face was tense, and his eyes constantly darted from side to side, reading some invisible signs. Several times he stopped and listened, forcing the entire detachment to freeze. At these moments, the silence became absolute, and it seemed as if the taiga itself was holding its breath. "Igorov," Severov called out to him quietly when they stopped once again. "Is something wrong?" The guide did not answer for a long time, then slowly shook his head. "The path is changing. Yesterday there was an animal path here, an elk path. Today it is gone. And there is another one. A human one. Streletsky's group? I don't know. The tracks are old, but strange. Too straight. As if people walked without bending their legs." Sergeant Chuv, a stocky man from Arkhangelsk who had spent his entire life hunting in the northern forests, spat nervously. "What the hell is even? Maybe the snow covered the uneven areas?" "No," Yegorov leaned over and pointed to the barely noticeable depressions in the snow. "Look. Heel, toe, heel, toe. The same interval. Nobody walks like that. It's like a march." Private Bayshev, a young Yakut who had been herding reindeer in the tundra before being called up, suddenly turned pale. "These are itchy spirits of the forest. They imitate people, but they don't understand how we really move." "Shut up," Chuv cut him off rudely. "Stop telling your stories." But Severov noticed that everyone else, including the medic Lisaina, were listening to Bayshev with intense attention. People were beginning to believe in the impossible, and that was a bad sign. "We move on," the lieutenant colonel said decisively. "And we follow only the facts. Streletsky's group followed this route. We follow in their footsteps. The rest is speculation." They moved on, but the atmosphere in the detachment changed. People walked closer to each other, often looking back. Kazantsev, the radio operator, never let go of the carbine, although he did not load a cartridge into the chamber. Severov forbade it. By midday the forest had become denser. The larches and cedars grew so densely that a person could hardly pass between them. The snow lay unevenly here, somewhere it formed deep snowdrifts, and somewhere the ground was almost bare, as if something was melting the snow from the inside. The air became heavy, viscous. It became more difficult to breathe, although the altitude above sea level was small. And then they saw the first camp. Igorov, who was walking ahead, suddenly froze and raised his hand. Severov approached him and saw something that made his heart skip a beat. In a small hollow between three huge cedars there were 3 tents. Military, standard green color. They were pitched perfectly straight, in a perfect triangle, as per regulations. The snow around the camp was trampled, but there were no traces of people. The strangest thing was that the tents looked as if they had just been abandoned. No traces of being in the taiga for weeks. "This is Streletsky's camp," Severov whispered, recognizing the standard airborne forces equipment. The squad carefully descended into the hollow. Chuv and Bayshev held their carbines at the ready, although there was no sound or movement around. Lisaina checked the improvised fireplace. The coals were cold, but looked as if the fire had gone out several hours ago, not days. Severov looked into the first tent. Everything was neatly laid out inside: sleeping bags, backpacks, personal belongings. On one of the backpacks he saw a familiar name, Lieutenant Voronov. He remembered this officer from his documents, a signalman from Streletsky's group. "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," Kazantsev called quietly. The radio operator stood at the entrance to the second tent, and his face was deathly pale. You must see this. Severov walked over and peered inside. There were photographs lying on an unfolded sleeping bag. Family photos that soldiers always carried with them. But all the photographs were ruined. Not torn, not soggy, ruined in a special way. Dark spots resembling mold were appearing on people's faces. The spots grew specifically on their faces, without affecting the rest of the photographs. As if something was methodically erasing human features, leaving only dark voids. What the hell is this? Chuv muttered, looking over his shoulder. Lisina took one of the photographs and examined it carefully. It's not mold. And it's not chemical exposure. It's like burning. But from the inside. Bayshev, who had been silent until then, suddenly spoke. Our legends say that when the Ichi take a person, they first erase his face from the world's memory. Photographs are the first to deteriorate. This time no one tried to silence him. They searched the entire camp. The weapons were still there, the food was untouched, the gear was intact. The people were gone, but there was no sign of a struggle, panic, or hasty retreat. It was as if 7 people had stood up at once and walked away into nowhere, leaving behind only ruined photographs. We need to check the radio station, Severov said. Kazantsev found a portable radio in the communications tent. It looked fine, but when he turned on the power, a strange sound came out of the speaker. Not the static that all radio operators were accustomed to. It was like a whisper. Many voices speaking at once in an incomprehensible language. The sound was quiet, but piercing. It penetrated straight to the brain, causing headaches and nausea. Turn it off, Severov ordered. Kazantsev's hands trembled as he felt for the switch, but the sound did not stop. The radio operator began to pound on the radio's body in a panic, trying to silence it. Battery! Pull out the battery! Chuv shouted. Only when Kazantsev tore out the power elements did the whispering finally cease. But in the silence that followed, it seemed to everyone that the voices continued to sound somewhere on the edge of consciousness. What was that? Lisina asked, massaging her temples. I don't know, Severov answered honestly. But we're leaving here. Immediately. He didn't want to stay in this camp a minute longer. Something was fundamentally wrong here. This place exuded a menace that couldn't be defined, but could be felt in every cell of his body. The party quickly gathered and left the hollow. But when they climbed the opposite slope and looked back, the camp was no longer there. Where 3 tents had just stood, only a flat snowy meadow between the cedars was visible. It's impossible, Chuv muttered, rubbing his eyes. A hallucination, Severov tried to find a rational explanation. Fatigue, stress. But Igorov shook his head. Not a hallucination. The forest showed us what it wanted to show. And now it hid it back. What do you mean, hid? Severov felt his logical picture of the world was cracking at the seams. Time flows differently here than in the big world. The past and the present are mixed up. We didn't see the camp of Streletsky's group. We saw the memory of it. Severov wanted to object, but the words stuck in his throat. Because deep inside he knew, the guide was right. What they saw was too perfect, too untouched to be real. It was a picture from the past, preserved in some incomprehensible memory of the forest. The squad moved on, but the mood had completely changed. People no longer joked or talked to each other. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, and these thoughts became darker with each step. It began to get dark towards evening, and Yegorov called a halt. They set up camp on a small hill, from where they had a good view of the surrounding area. But even this did not add confidence. The forest around them stood like a silent wall, and in this silence they seemed to sense expectation. Severov sat by his tent and went over the events of the day in his mind. The rational part of his mind desperately tried to find a logical explanation for what he had seen. But the other part, older and wiser, already knew the truth. They had entered a place where different laws operated. Where the taiga really saw, remembered, and thought. And now it was studying them, as they had studied the ruined photographs. The night promised to be long and full of discoveries for which neither of them was prepared. The night after the camp disappeared was hell. No one slept. People sat in their tents, listening to the silence, which was more terrible than any scream. Every rustle, every crack of a branch seemed like the steps of an invisible enemy. Severov sat until dawn with a pistol in his hand, although he knew perfectly well that the weapon was useless against this. His enemy had no flesh. His enemy was everywhere. The morning brought no relief. It brought only a gray, indifferent light that filtered through the dense treetops and made everything around them seem flat and unreal. The squad gathered in silence. Their faces were drawn, their eyes sunken. Discipline, the core of any military operation, began to melt like snow in the spring sun. "We're moving west," Severov ordered, trying to make his voice sound confident. "Igorov, lead the way." The guide merely nodded silently and moved forward, but now he walked differently. He no longer tried to find paths. He moved intuitively, as if listening to something that only he could hear. They had been walking for about an hour when the worst began. Severov was the first to sense it. He thought about the failure of the mission, about the report he would write if they managed to get out. He thought about the anger of his superiors, about his ruined career. And suddenly, with a gust of wind, he heard a barely audible whisper that repeated his thought exactly: ruined career. He stopped abruptly and turned around. No one. Just trees and the backs of his fighters. He chalked it up to an auditory hallucination, to fatigue. But after a few minutes, the medic Lisina shuddered and pressed her hand to her temple. She thought about Kazantsev, about his empty eyes, and tried to diagnose him. Acute dissociative reaction flashed through her mind. And then, with the rustle of frost falling from a branch, she heard, reaction. She met Severov's gaze. In her eyes he saw the same horror and disbelief that he felt. Taiga began to speak to them. But she did not speak her own words. She reflected their own thoughts, like an echo in an empty hall. She turned their inner world into a weapon against themselves. Panic was growing slowly, like poison penetrating the blood. Sergeant Chuyev, the biggest skeptic in the group, thought with irritation, "We should have gotten out of here yesterday." And then the crunch of a branch under his foot sounded like an answer: "Get out." He cursed, spat, but his face was covered in sweat. Private Bayshev, who had believed in spirits from the start, was less frightened than the others, but his peace was also disturbed. He thought about his village, about his wife, and the whispers of the forest returned to him, fragments of her voice, distorted, cold, devoid of warmth. It was the most sophisticated torture. You couldn't hide from your thoughts. Every fear, every doubt, every hope instantly became the property of the forest and returned, strengthened, mocking. People stopped thinking. They tried to clear their minds, but the emptiness was even more terrible, because then the forest began to fill it with its own, ancient, alien content. By midday the squad was on the verge of complete exhaustion. They walked like automatons, afraid to raise their eyes, afraid to take an extra breath. And then Yegorov stopped again. He pointed forward with his hand. About 100 meters away from them, in the snow, a chain of footprints was visible. People, Chuv said hoarsely. Finally. Maybe Streletsky's group. They rushed forward, driven by desperate hope. But as they drew closer, Severov realized that something was wrong. The tracks were too familiar. He leaned down and saw the imprint of his own boot, with the characteristic worn heel. These are our tracks, Lisina whispered. They stood there in a daze. They had been walking west for 4 hours without deviating from their course. But they were back where they had been that morning. It can't be. Chuyev roared, ripping his carbine from his shoulder. I don't believe it. This is some kind of crap. Taiga is playing with us, Yegorov said quietly. It doesn't want us to leave. It's studying us. It's interested. It was a monstrous explanation, but it was the only one. They were not just lost travelers. They were guinea pigs in a giant labyrinth whose walls were constantly changing. The despair, hidden until that moment under a layer of discipline, burst out. Chuv began to scream, showering the forest with curses. Beishev fell to his knees and began to pray in his own language. Lisina simply sat in the snow, clutching her head in her hands. Stand up! Severov barked. His voice broke, but there was a last spark of power in it. Everyone stand up. Panic is exactly what she's waiting for. He managed to bring the detachment to its senses with difficulty. He understood that they needed a rest stop. But staying in place was even more dangerous. We'll go on, he decided. But now we'll follow our own tracks. Back. It was the only logical solution. If they made a circle, then there must be an exit somewhere. They set off in the opposite direction. But the forest wasn't going to let them go that easily. An hour into their journey, they noticed that the tracks were starting to disappear. Not just buried in the snow. They were melting, dissolving into the crust, as if they had never been there. The taiga was erasing their retreat route. Dusk fell. Exhausted, frightened, they set up camp. The night promised to be the last for their sanity. It was then that Chuv disappeared. He walked a few meters away from the camp to take a piss, as he put it. He left with his carbine, full of his usual gruff confidence. He had been gone 5 minutes. 10. 15. Chuv. Severov called. Silence. Sergeant. Answer. In response, only the rustling of branches. They began searching. Yegorov walked ahead, trying to find tracks. But the snow was smooth, as if the sergeant had simply vanished into thin air 10 paces from the camp. They shouted, called his name, but the taiga was silent. The whispers had ceased. And this silence was the most terrible threat. They searched for him for almost an hour until Yegorov stopped them. It's no use, he said. The forest got him. They returned to camp. No one could sleep. They sat by the dying fire, each thinking the same thing. They were next. They found him at dawn. He was found by Beishev, who had gone to the stream for water. Yakut did not scream. He simply returned to the fire, and Severov understood everything from his face. They followed him. Chuv was standing 20 meters from the camp, in the thicket of young spruce trees. He stood absolutely motionless, his back pressed against the trunk of a tree. His carbine lay at his feet. His eyes were open, but they were empty, like a mannequin's. He was not breathing. Lisina rushed to him. She tried to feel his pulse on his neck, but pulled her hand back as if from a burn. He's cold," she whispered. "But not like a dead man. He's cold like a tree." Severov came closer. The skin on the sergeant's face had acquired a grayish-green tint. It had become rough, like bark. His arms, hanging down along his body, seemed to have grown into the trunk. "He's still alive," Yegorov said quietly. "But his soul is already inside. Listening." And then Chuv's lips moved. A quiet, incoherent whisper poured out. But it was not his voice. It was the same multi-voiced hum they had heard from the radio in the first camp. It was the point of no return. They watched their comrade cease to be human and become part of the forest. They were no longer looking for the missing plane. They were no longer following orders. They had only one task left: to survive. And to get out of this green hell before it swallowed them all. They left Chuv there, among the young fir trees. They left him like you would leave a broken thing that can no longer serve. The decision was made with inhuman difficulty for Severov, but he understood that any attempt to take the sergeant with them would be tantamount to suicide. He was no longer a man. He had become part of this place, a living monument to their failure. Lisina was crying. Silently, soundlessly, tears streamed down her weather-beaten face. She, as a doctor who had taken an oath to save lives, was forced to abandon a living person to be devoured by the forest. Bayshev was whispering something in his own language, either addressing the spirits or Chuv himself, asking for his forgiveness. And only Yegorov, the guide, remained calm as the taiga itself. His face was impenetrable. He had seen this before. They moved on, no longer trying to find a way out. They simply followed where their feet led, driven by animal fear. There were 4 of them left. 4 small, frightened people in a vast green ocean that was slowly digesting their will. The whisper in their heads did not stop, but now it had changed. It no longer reflected their thoughts. It began to show them someone else's. Severov was the first to see it again. He was walking, looking down at his feet, trying to concentrate on a simple mechanical action, and suddenly out of the corner of his eye he noticed movement to the left. He jerked his head up. A man stood between the trunks of the cedars. In a torn, decayed quilted jacket, with puttees on his legs instead of boots. His face was emaciated, overgrown with stubble, but his eyes were empty. Absolutely empty. The man looked through Severov, and in his gaze there was nothing but endless, melancholy fatigue. He held a rusty pick in his hands. Severov instinctively reached for his pistol, but Yegorov stopped him, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Don't touch it," he whispered. "It's not a person. It's a memory." The figure in the quilted jacket slowly turned its head and looked at Severov. Its lips moved, and the lieutenant colonel caught a fragment of a thought, alien, as old as the permafrost itself: rations, cold, one more day. It was a prisoner. One of the thousands who perished in the Gulag camps scattered across this land. He was not a ghost. He was an echo. A recording that the taiga played for its new guests. The figure dissolved, blending into the shadows of the trees. But half an hour later they saw another. A hunter dressed in deerskin stood by the stream, holding a flintlock rifle. He looked at the water with the same blank expression. And then another, a geologist in round glasses and a canvas jacket from the expedition of the 30s. He was sitting on a fallen tree, running his finger along a map that was not there. They walked through a living museum, an archive of souls that the taiga had collected over centuries. Each figure was perfectly real, but lifeless. They were like wax exhibits that sometimes came to life to utter a single thought frozen in time. "She's showing us her collection," Lisina said quietly. Her voice trembled. "She's showing us what's going to happen to us." Severov didn't answer. He tried to fight it, tried to find logic in it. Maybe it was gas. Maybe mass hypnosis. But his mind couldn't find any more rational clues. He was forced to accept the rules of this game. By evening they came to a huge clearing. And they saw him. Airplane. It wasn't broken. It wasn't burning. The IL-14 lay on its belly in the middle of a clearing, with almost no damage to the trees. Like a giant bird, tired, sitting down to rest on a cushion of moss and snow. It was intact, except for a few dents in the fuselage. That was impossible. An airplane that size couldn't land like that in the taiga. It should have been torn to pieces. "The forest, it caught him," Bashev whispered. "Like a spider catches a fly." They approached the plane carefully. The hatch was slightly open. There was a dead silence all around, broken only by the whistle of the wind in the stabilizers. Severov, as the commander, had to go first. He took out his pistol, checked the bolt and slowly climbed the short ramp. The interior smelled of kerosene, metal, and something else. A sweetish smell of decay and ozone at the same time. He walked down the narrow corridor, peering into the cargo hold. Empty. The uranium containers were gone. The cargo was gone. Severov's heart began to pound. He reached the cockpit. The door was open. He looked inside. And what he saw was more terrible than all the ghosts of the Gulag. There were two men sitting in the chairs. Pilot Kravtsov and his co-pilot. They were in uniform, strapped in. Their hands were on the control sticks, their fingers gripping them with a strength that could not be maintained after death. Their heads were thrown back, their eyes looking at the ceiling of the cabin. The same empty, serene eyes as Chuv's. Their faces were frozen in an expression of utter amazement. "Are they alive?" Lisina's voice rang out from behind her, and she couldn't stand it any longer and stood up after him. "Worse," Severov croaked. Because at that moment, the pilots simultaneously, synchronously turned their heads and looked at them. Their movements were smooth, inhuman. And their lips began to move. That same sound poured out of the cabin. A quiet, multi-voiced hum that they had heard from the radio. But now it was clearer, louder. It came from two throats, but was one. It was the taiga itself speaking, using the pilots' bodies as speakers. It was at that moment that Severov understood everything. Every detail of the mosaic fell into place. The whisper. The vanished traces. The ghosts of the past. Chuv's empty eyes. The perfectly preserved plane. And the pilots who became the mouthpiece of the forest. Taiga didn't kill. She collected. She collected souls the way an entomologist collects butterflies, pricking them with a needle and placing them in an endless album. She was not evil. Evil is too human a concept. She was curious. An ancient, alien mind that had slept for millennia and now woke up and began to study the strangest creatures that had invaded its domain, people. It took them apart, into thoughts, fears, memories, and then reassembled them, this time as part of itself. The vanished did not die. They became the eyes and ears of the taiga. They became its nerve endings. Streletsky's group. Pilots. Prisoners. Hunters. They were all here now, in this living library, their consciousnesses woven into a single, gigantic web. And now the taiga wanted to add new exhibits to its collection. 4 people from Lieutenant Colonel Severov's detachment. The hum in the cabin grew louder. It began to take shape. Severov, whose consciousness was at its limit, began to discern words in this hum. Not Russian, not Evenk. Words that did not exist in any language in the world. But he understood them. He understood them not with his mind, but with something deeper. Why are you afraid of unity? Flashed through his head. We want to see with your eyes. Don't go, stay, and you will see everything. It was not a demand. It was an invitation. Seductive, like a siren's song. An invitation to give up your small, mortal self in exchange for eternal, all-encompassing knowledge. To become part of something greater. To stop being afraid, suffering, doubting. To just be. To just see. Severov looked at Lysina. Her eyes were unfocused. She was listening. And the same peaceful, detached expression that he had seen on Chuv began to appear on her face. He realized that they had seconds left. A little more and they would give in. The temptation was too great. He grabbed Lysina by the hand and forcefully pulled her out of the cabin, away from that hypnotic hum. Get back, he shouted to Bayshev and Yegorov, who were standing at the entrance. Everyone out. Immediately. They tumbled out of the plane and into the snow. The hum was quieter, but it didn't go away. It was still in their heads. An invitation. A promise. They stood in the middle of a clearing, next to the plane that had become a tomb and a temple at the same time. For survivors in the center of a living archive of souls. And now they knew the truth. But this truth did not give them salvation. It only showed the full depth of the abyss on the edge of which they found themselves. They retreated from the plane as if from a plague altar. The 4 survivors stood in a snowy clearing, the hum coming from the cockpit pulsing in their skulls like a second, alien heart muscle. It was no longer just noise. It had become a voice. A single voice, woven from the whispers of the pilots, from Chiev's silent thoughts, from the forgotten suffering of the camp prisoners, and from the ancient, inhuman consciousness of the taiga itself. The voice did not shout. It coaxed. It seeped into the mind like water seeping into the cracks of a rock, slowly but inexorably widening them. Why, fear? He rustled with thoughts that seemed his own. Fear is loneliness, we offer unity. Severov tried to fight. He clutched the pistol grip, the cold metal the only anchor holding him to reality. He repeated to himself his service number, rank, last name, everything that proved his separateness, his I. But the voice was insistent. Your I is pain, the memory of mistakes, the burden of orders. We will remove this burden, you will be able to rest, just see, without pain, without guilt. He looked at his companions. Bayshev, a young Yakut, had fallen to his knees and was rocking from side to side, covering his ears with his hands. But it was no use. The voice was coming not from outside, but from inside. Yegorov stood motionless, his face like a mask carved from wood, but Severov could see from the tense muscles on his cheekbones what a colossal internal struggle he was waging. The guide was fighting not with willpower, but with emptiness. He was trying not to think, not to feel, to become as empty as the sky above them. But the worst thing was with Lieutenant. Olga stood looking at the plane, and a strange, detached calm began to appear on her face, which had been distorted with horror only minutes before. Her lips were half open, her eyes unfocused. She was listening. And she understood. "You wanted to know," the voice whispered to her. "Why do they die? Why do they suffer? We will give you the answers, all the answers. You will see every cell, every thought, every pain, and you will understand the harmony of everything." For her, a doctor who had spent her life fighting the chaos of disease and death, this offer was a diabolical temptation. To see the whole picture. To understand the grand design, if there was one. To stop being a small, blind kitten, trying to heal wounds without understanding their cause. At that moment, figures began to move across the clearing like shadows. Ghosts from the archive of souls. They emerged from behind the trees, a geologist with a map, a hunter with a gun, a prisoner with a pick. They walked slowly, silently, and surrounded them. And now they were all looking at them. Dozens of empty, serene eyes. And they all spoke. With one voice. Become one of us. Become one of the eyes. We are waiting. Lieutenant slowly, as if in a dream, took a step forward, towards the plane. "Olga, stop!" Severov shouted, rushing towards her. She turned her face to him. And he saw in her eyes the same expression as the pilot's. Calm, clear, inhuman. "Valerie, you don't understand," she said in her own voice, but the intonations were alien, melodious, like the voice of the taiga itself. "There is no death here. There is no pain here. There is only knowledge. It is so beautiful. I see everything. I see your heart beating. I see your fear. But soon you will stop being afraid. We will all stop." She smiled. It was not her smile. It was the smile of something ancient, infinitely wise, and utterly alien. She took another step. And another. She walked toward them, toward that silent army of ghosts, to join their ranks. Severov realized that he had lost her. He could have shot her, he could have tried to drag her away by force. But he was not fighting a woman. He was fighting an idea that had already taken over her mind. He had lost. At that moment, it was as if an electric shock had struck him. An epiphany, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. They couldn't win. They couldn't negotiate. They couldn't understand. The only way to save themselves was to run. Run like a forest fire, like a plague. The words of Erection, the old guide who survived, floated into his head: Silver River. Walk at night, when the moon is out, and think of nothing. Taiga hears thoughts. Whoever is afraid, stays. Think of nothing. That was the key. The only one. Don't fight the voice, don't argue with it. Just empty your mind. Become an empty vessel. Like Igorov was trying to become. He rushed to the guide. Yegorov. Erection spoke about the Silver River. Do you know where it is? Igorov blinked slowly, as if emerging from a deep trance. I know, his voice was hoarse. 2 days to the east. If the forest lets go. He'll let us in, Severov said with desperate confidence. If we stop being interesting to him. If we stop thinking. He turned to Bayshev, who was still kneeling, mumbling prayers. Severov grabbed him roughly by the collar and pulled him to his feet. Get up, soldier. Prayers won't help here. Just an empty head and fast legs. Listen to me. Don't think about anything. Not about home, not about fear, not about me. Just look at my back and go. Understood? Bayshev nodded fearfully, his eyes were like those of a hunted animal. And Lysina. Olga had already reached the edge of the clearing. She stood in line with the ghosts, turned to face them and smiled her last, farewell smile. And then her figure began to melt, becoming transparent, merging with the trees behind her. She became part of the collection. Another exhibit in the endless archive of the taiga. Severov turned away. He couldn't watch it. He felt a part of his soul dying with her. But he couldn't afford grief. Grief was a thought. And any thought here was a death sentence. Yegorov, lead the way. He barked. To the east. To the river. Bayshev, follow me. And remember, not a single thought. Count your steps, sing stupid songs to yourself, remember the multiplication table, anything, just so you don't have to think. Run. And they ran. They ran away from the plane. Away from the ghost army. And the taiga screamed in their heads. The voice was no longer seductive. It became demanding, angry. Where will you not go? You are part of us. The trees around them seemed to come alive. Branches lashed at their faces, roots snaked out from under the snow, trying to grab their legs. The fog thickened, turning the forest into a maze without walls. But they ran. Severov ran and repeated to himself, like a mantra, the lines from the guard duty regulations. Dry, soulless, official words. They were his shield. Yegorov ran easily, his mind seemed to be truly empty, it turned into pure movement. Bayshev stumbled, fell, but got up and ran again, his lips silently moving the words of a prayer, which was now not a request, but simply a set of sounds, drowning out the whisper of the forest. They were running from the all-seeing eye, from the collective mind that did not understand why its new, interesting toys were trying to escape its embrace. They were running to the saving river, to the moon, to the void. And every step took them further from the human world and deeper into the heart of primordial, thinking horror. They ran. This was not the flight of soldiers retreating under enemy fire. This was the flight of souls breaking free from an invisible net. They rushed through the twilight forest, and the taiga itself seemed to have turned into a single, living organism that was trying to hold them back, to return them to its collection. The trees were moving. Severov swore he saw it out of the corner of his eye. The trunks shifted like chess pieces on a board, blocking their path, forcing them to twist and turn. Thick, gnarled roots, like the gnarled fingers of a giant, raised the snow and grew in their path, turning into insurmountable barriers. The branches of ancient cedars and firs lashed at their faces not by chance, but with surgical precision, aiming for their eyes, trying to knock them off their feet. And the voice. The voice in their head no longer coaxed. It demanded. It screamed, using the voices of those they had lost. Valerie, come back. Lysina's voice, full of inhuman, calm reproach, sounded in Severov's mind. You left me alone. There is so much to see here. Why are you running from knowledge? Are your orders more important than the truth? Commander, Sergeant Chuv's voice wheezed in my ears, as if coming from beneath the thickness of the tree bark. My legs won't go, it's cold, but there's no fear. There's no fear here, Commander. Come back, help, it's so peaceful here. Severov gritted his teeth until they creaked, trying to drown out this chorus of the dead. He clung to the lines of the regulations, repeating them like a spell. A sentry is an armed guard who carries out a combat mission to protect and defend the post assigned to him. Dry, lifeless words were his only shield against this torrent of temptation and guilt. Private Bayshev, running after him, was on the verge of a breakdown. He was no longer praying. He was simply sobbing, and with each sob, fragments of names came out of his mouth: his mother, his wife, his children. And the taiga immediately picked them up, returning the voices of his loved ones to him, distorted, cold, calling him to stay in this green paradise where there is no separation. Only Yegorov, the guide, seemed invulnerable. He ran lightly, barely touching the ground, his face blank, his eyes staring ahead, not focusing on anything. He had become pure movement, a will devoid of thought. He was what they were all desperately trying to become, an empty vessel. They ran for hours, losing track of time. The forest never ended. It was endless. Each clearing was like the last, each ravine repeated the curves of the past. They were trapped, in a giant time loop that the taiga had created to wear them down, to break their will. Bayshev was the first to break. He tripped over a root, fell into the snow and never got up again. He just lay there, curled up, crying like a child. "I can't," he whispered. "She's calling. Mom's calling. I'm tired." Severov ran up to him and tried to lift him up. "Get up, soldier. That's an order." But there was no longer any fear in Bayshev's eyes. There was only endless fatigue and relief. He gave in. He accepted the invitation. "Leave him," Yegorov said quietly, stopping next to her. "He's not with us anymore. His soul is still there, with his mother." And to confirm his words, Bayshev's figure on the snow began to slowly become transparent, like morning fog. He was not dying. He was simply disappearing from this world, moving into another, into the world of taiga memory. Severov recoiled. There were two of them left. Two against the whole forest. The hope that had been glimmering in his soul began to fade. He looked at Yegorov. There was no despair in the guide's eyes. There was some strange, calm determination in them. "We won't break free," Yegorov said as simply as if he were talking about the weather. "She's too strong. And too curious. She won't let us go until she understands us completely. So what should we do?" Severov croaked, feeling his own will begin to crumble. Igorov looked at him for a long time, and then his gaze slid over the trees, over the sky, as if saying goodbye. "We must give her what she wants," he said. "Not our souls. But our eyes. She wants to see. I will become her eyes." Severov did not immediately understand the meaning of these words. "What do you mean?" "Yurekshin survived because someone stayed in his place. That's what the old people said. There must always be an exchange. A sacrifice. Taiga is not evil. It is the balance. It will take one thing to let go of the other." He approached a huge, ancient cedar, the trunk of which was 3 times the circumference of a man. He placed his palm on its wrinkled, moss-covered bark. "I know this forest. I was born here. My ancestors are buried under these roots. My thoughts are clearer to her than yours, Commander. My soul is the best payment. No. Severov stepped towards him. We will find another way. There is no other way, Yegorov answered softly. You have to find the plane. You have to tell them, even though they won't believe you. And I'm tired of running. I want to stay home. The moment he said these words, everything in the forest became silent. The voices in Severov's head fell silent. The wind stopped howling. There was absolute, deafening silence. It was as if the taiga, this entire gigantic, thinking organism, held its breath, listening to the proposal. Igorov closed his eyes. His face became peaceful. He stood, pressing his palm to the cedar, and Severov saw a slight tremor run through his body. It was not a tremor of fear. It was a tremor of resonance. He was tuning into the frequency of the forest. She agrees, Yegorov whispered, without opening his eyes. She will show you the way. The Silver River, it's there, behind the hill, follow the light of the morning star. His body began to change. The skin on his face darkened, became rougher. His hair seemed to turn into dry moss. Slowly, very slowly, he began to merge with the tree, growing into it like a branch grows into a trunk. Farewell, Commander, his voice came not from his lips, but from everywhere at once. It was calm, deep, and infinitely ancient. Don't be afraid. Now I will see for her, forever. Severov stood, frozen with horror and awe. He watched as the last truly living man in this forest became a part of it. Yegorov's figure lost its outlines, becoming indistinguishable from the trunk of an old cedar. And only his eyes, before finally disappearing, opened for a moment. And in them Severov saw not emptiness, but the entire universe. Endless star fields, the birth and death of galaxies, all the wisdom and all the sorrow of eternity. And then it all ended. There was just a tree standing in front of him. But Severov knew that it was not so. He knew that now Yegorov was looking at him through the eyes of this tree, through the eyes of the entire forest. And the forest did change. The oppressive atmosphere was gone. The fog began to dissipate. And ahead, between the trees, a clear, moonlit passage appeared. A ghostly corridor leading out of this hell. Taiga kept her end of the deal. She was letting him go. Severov stood for a moment longer, looking at the cedar that had once been a man. He could not find the words to say goodbye. He simply saluted, to the empty clearing, the silent forest, and the soul of the guide who had paid the ultimate price to save him. And then he turned and walked. Alone. Along the road bought at the cost of someone else's life. He walked, without looking back, to the Silver River, to salvation. But he knew that he would never leave this taiga the same. Part of his soul remained here forever, under the all-seeing eye of the forest, which had just found its new, most faithful guardian. Answer, query, let's proceed to the final 8th chapter according to the plot and structure. The volume of the chapter is more than 6,000 characters, query, answer, got it. This is the finale. The end of the journey, the conclusion, and that last note that will sound long after the end of the story. The chapter will be voluminous, gloomy, and will leave a feeling of incompleteness, as is proper in our genre. Chapter 8. Living Dead. Severov walked along the ghostly corridor that the taiga had opened for him. He felt neither fatigue, nor cold, nor hunger. All his senses had become dulled, burned out, leaving behind only a ringing emptiness. He walked like an automaton, mechanically moving his legs, and there was not a single thought in his head. Yegorov's sacrifice had worked, the taiga had gotten what it wanted and ceased to be interested in his mind. It had let him go. But this freedom was like death. He came out to the Silver River at dawn. The river, frozen over, really did sparkle in the first rays of the sun, like the blade of a giant knife cutting the taiga in two. It was a border. A border between the world of living, thinking horror and the world of people. He crossed it without looking back, and only when he found himself on the other bank did he allow himself to fall into the snow. He was found 2 days later. A border patrol, having given up hope of finding anyone alive, came across a lone figure wandering along a frozen river. It was Lieutenant Colonel Severov. He was exhausted, his face frostbitten, his gaze empty. He could not clearly explain what had happened. He answered all questions with the same phrase, "Everyone died." Forest fire. This version became official. A report was sent to Moscow, compiled not by Severov, but by a special commission. It spoke of a tragic accident. That the missing IL-14 had probably crashed, causing a massive forest fire that raged for several weeks. The fire destroyed both the plane with the secret cargo and both search teams that found themselves in its epicenter. Lieutenant Colonel Severov was the only survivor, a hero who miraculously escaped the fiery hell, but suffered severe psychological trauma and partial amnesia. It was a convenient, logical, and completely false story. The cargo was written off as irretrievably lost. The dead were nominated for posthumous awards. The case was closed and filed away with the stamp, "Keep Forever." The system did what it did best, buried the inconvenient truth under tons of paper. Severov spent several months in a closed KGB sanatorium outside Moscow. Doctors treated him for combat stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. They pumped him full of drugs, conducted hypnosis sessions, trying to restore lost memories. But his memory was locked, the key to which remained there, in the Siberian taiga, at the foot of an ancient cedar. He kept silent. He knew that any attempt to tell the truth would end for him not in a sanatorium, but in a ward in Kashchenko with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He accepted the rules of the game. He became a living dead man, keeping within himself a secret that was too great for the human world. 6 months later, he was declared fit for limited service and transferred to a quiet, staff position in the archive department. There, where he could no longer harm anyone with his truth. He became a shadow man who went through folders with other people's secrets every day, knowing that the most terrible of them would never be written down on paper. Life went on. The country built communism, launched satellites into space, prepared for new wars. And Severov lived in his own quiet hell. He stopped sleeping at night. As soon as he closed his eyes, he was there again, in the green darkness. He saw the empty eyes of Chuv, growing into the tree. He heard Lisina's farewell smile. He felt Yegorov's gaze on him, who now looked at the world through the eyes of the entire forest. These dreams were not nightmares. They were too real. These were not memories. These were visits. He began to fear trees. Any trees. The old poplar outside the window of his Moscow apartment seemed like a spy. The park alleys seemed like an enemy formation. He walked the streets with his head down, trying not to look at the green crowns, because it seemed to him that every leaf, every branch was watching him, whispering, passing on information further, along an invisible network that stretched for thousands of kilometers, into the very heart of Siberia. The taiga did not let him go. Yegorov's sacrifice gave him physical freedom, but not spiritual. He brought a piece of it with him. Its spore. And this spore slowly but steadily grew in his consciousness. Sometimes he had dreams in which he himself was the forest. He felt the sap flowing down its trunk spine, its branches arms reaching toward the sky, its roots nerves going deep into the earth, intertwining with the roots of other trees. In these dreams he saw everything. He saw a deer being born and dying, an ant dragging its burden, a bear sleeping under the snow. He saw the past, present, and future all at once. It was majestic and monstrous. And he woke up in a cold sweat, not understanding where he, Lieutenant Colonel Severov, ended and she, the taiga, began. He knew he was going crazy. But it wasn't the kind of madness that doctors treat. It was different. It was a process of transformation. He became a bridge between two worlds. A final witness who carried both a gift and a curse. Years passed. Severov grew old. He retired, becoming a quiet, unsociable pensioner. He lived alone in his small apartment, filled with books he did not read. He simply sat by the window and looked at the world. But he saw it differently than others. He saw invisible connections between things. He sensed the approach of rain the day before the weather forecasters issued a storm warning. He knew when the old dog in the neighboring yard would die. He saw the aura of fear around people rushing about their business. The knowledge that the taiga gave him seeped into his world, making it unbearably transparent. In the last scene we see him, already an old man, sitting in a chair by the window. It is spring outside. The poplar tree under the window has budded. Severov looks at them, and for the first time in many years something resembling a smile appears on his face. He stretches out his dry, wrinkled hand and touches the cold windowpane, as if touching the bark of a tree. He closes his eyes. And he sees. He doesn't see his room. He sees the endless, green taiga. He sees himself standing next to an ancient cedar. He sees Lisina, Chuv, Bayshev, the pilots, the prisoners, everyone who has become part of the forest. They do not suffer. They simply observe. They are the eyes of a great, calm mind. And among them stands Yegorov, nodding to him as if to an old friend. Severov opens his eyes. The smile never leaves his face. He no longer fights. He has accepted his fate. He understands that running away was an illusion, a delay. Taiga has waited patiently for him to be ready. And now he is ready. He took a quiet, last breath. His heart stopped. But his consciousness did not go out. It burst out of his old, worn-out body, like a butterfly from a cocoon, and flew east, across thousands of kilometers, home. To where they were waiting for him. To where he could finally see everything. He became another pair of eyes in the endless forest. His story was over. But the story of the taiga, which sees everything, was just beginning. And now she saw the world through his eyes, too. The eyes of a KGB lieutenant colonel. And this was the most interesting acquisition in her centuries-old collection. He came out of the forest alone. When the border patrol found him trudging across the frozen Silver River, they saw not a man but an empty shell into which frostbitten bones and tired flesh had been hastily stuffed. He did not resist, did not rejoice, did not cry. He simply allowed them to lead him from the realm of green silence back to the world of people, and this transition was more painful for him than any injury. The noise of helicopter blades seemed vulgar and shrill after the majestic silence of the taiga. The voices of the rescuers were a meaningless collection of sounds. He returned, but his soul remained behind him, woven into the roots of an ancient cedar. The interrogations at the Yakut KGB were like surrealist theater. He sat in a warm, heated room, and in front of him people in plain clothes asked questions to which there were no answers that a person could understand. They asked about saboteurs, about the weather, about a technical malfunction. And he looked through them and saw a birch branch swaying outside the window, and he felt it watching him. He lied. He lied calmly, methodically, with the indifference of a dead man. Forest fire, he repeated, and the words were alien, empty. A wall of fire. The plane burned. Everyone died. I survived by a miracle. He saw the relief in their eyes. The system had gotten what it could handle. A tragedy, an accident, a natural disaster. They had written a report, his lies neatly wrapped in official language. They had called him a hero, the sole survivor, and the heroic mask was heavier than a lead shroud. He had betrayed them all, Lisina, Chuv, Bayshev, the pilots. And worst of all, he had betrayed Yegorov, whose sacrifice had been devalued, reduced to a footnote in the fire report. But he had kept silent, because he knew the truth would not set him free. It would only lock him away in a padded cell for the rest of his days. In Moscow, he was treated for an injury. Doctors tried to get into his head, to pull out the splinter of memories that they took for an illness. But they did not understand. The forest was not the illness. The world was the illness. The world, which after the all-encompassing intelligence of the taiga, seemed suffocatingly cramped, flat and blind. He saw people running about their business, immersed in their petty fears and desires, not knowing that above them, below them, around them, there was something huge, eternal, breathing. He felt like an alien, the only sighted person in the kingdom of the blind, who was forced to pretend that he, too, saw nothing. He returned to work in the archives department, in a kingdom of dust and forgotten cases. It was the perfect place for a living dead man. He spent days on end sorting through files, reading about other people's tragedies, and each of them seemed like a child's fairy tale compared to the one he had lived through. But the taiga did not let him go. She came to him. Not in his dreams, he had almost stopped sleeping. She came in the rustling of leaves outside the window. In the pattern of cracks in the asphalt that formed a picture of roots. In the hum of wires that reminded him of that same, many-voiced whisper. She was everywhere. She waited patiently. He began to talk to Yegorov. Not out loud. Mentally. Sometimes, sitting in his empty apartment, he closed his eyes and addressed the guide who had become a tree. "Do you see me, old man?" he thought. And in response, not a word but a feeling was born in his consciousness. A feeling of deep, all-understanding peace. And a vision. He saw the taiga through Yegorov's eyes. He saw how a squirrel jumped from branch to branch, how the first shoot broke through under the snow, how the moonlight silvered the tops of the cedars. He saw the life of the forest, slow, majestic, devoid of human vanity. And these moments were the only relief in his gray existence. Years passed. Gray hair covered his temples, deep wrinkles appeared on his face. He had long since retired. He had become a recluse. His only companion was the old poplar tree under his window. He knew this tree. He knew when a branch would ache, when its roots would feel water. The poplar became his window into that other world. In the last winter of his life, he stopped leaving the house. The spores of the taiga, carried into his soul, finally sprouted. He no longer felt like a man. He was something else. A lonely nerve ending of a giant organism, abandoned far from the main body. And he felt how this body was calling him home. One April evening, when the air smelled of melting snow and spring, he realized that the time had come. The call became unbearably loud, insistent. It was not pain. It was longing. Longing for unity, for home. He sat down in his old chair by the window. He was not ill, his heart was still strong. But he had made a decision. He was tired of being here. He wanted to go. There. He closed his eyes and mentally addressed Yegorov for the last time. "I'm ready." And this time the answer was not a feeling, but a clear, distinct image. He saw a road. Not a path in the forest. A path of light leading from his chair to the east, through cities, rivers, and mountains, straight to the very cedar that had become his guide. He took a deep breath, and it was his last human breath. And as he exhaled, he let go. He let go of his body, his memory, his name. He let the thread that connected him to this world fray and break. There was no pain, no fear. There was only a feeling of incredible liberation. As if he had been carrying a heavy spacesuit on his shoulders all his life and was finally able to throw it off. His consciousness, his true self, slipped out of his physical shell and rushed along the path of light. He flew over Moscow at night, over sleepy villages, over dark forests. He saw the world as a god or a bird sees it. And he was no longer alone. Along the way, he was joined by other sparks of light, the souls of those who, like him, had once been touched by the taiga and were now returning home. He reached it at dawn. An endless green sea, covered with morning mist. He had found his cedar. And he entered it as one enters an open door. There was a fusion. His consciousness, his memory, all his life experience, all of it merged into the giant, collective mind of the taiga. He felt delight and horror at the same time. He became everything. He was every tree, every leaf, every root. He felt the water running underground, the fox sleeping in its hole, the chick hatching in its nest. He saw the past, the glacier coming down from these mountains. And the future, the distant future, where forests would grow again in place of cities. And he saw them all. Lysina, Chuv, Bayshev. They were here. Their minds, cleansed of fear and pain, were woven into a common web, like bright threads in an endless tapestry. They were not dead. They were eternal. The last human thought that flashed through his new, boundless consciousness was a thought about himself. About Lieutenant Colonel Valery Severov. This man had died in his Moscow apartment. But he himself, he had only just been truly born. And the taiga, which sees everything, acquired a new, most valuable pair of eyes. Eyes that knew how people think. Eyes that saw their cities, their weapons, their fears. Eyes that could look from the very heart of civilization. And now she was ready to listen and watch in a new way. Patiently. Forever. Waiting for other lost souls to come to her, seeking answers. And she was ready to answer them.